right? Like a combative mode. So just thinking about what happens in this positioning is, people are kept apart. People lose their agency. We stop thinking about things like first voice, right? Because we bring in other people to manage the conflict, to assume the role of storyteller or, scripting kind of language. And that's another thing too. I mean, really, all of a sudden, your life and your experience is reduced to words on a piece of paper. And I think that is probably something that we're used to seeing in the mental health space as well, right? Like reports and summaries and whatever that are crafted by someone else other than the person who's actually being, or is having the struggles. So what this produces, what this positioning really produces is that compounded harm. And this process in and of itself really erodes dignity, and it invalidates the human experience. So we have, up until now, really tried to avoid the use of the term justice in this space, because for some reason in the healthcare system, when you say the word justice, you have an anaphylactic reaction. Like, it's just, we think about it in terms of, punishment and that kind of like adversarial positioning. But I found this slide, and I really thought that it really spoke to me, because I think we're probably all quite familiar with seeing how equality is thought of versus equity. But I really like to see that justice is kind of that next step, right? Like, justice is the cause where the inequity was addressed. So the systemic barrier has been removed. And I think this is where we need to start moving in that direction, right? Where we are removing those barriers. We're not just giving people props to support them, to lift them up, but we're actually like getting rid of those structures that are reproducing inequality and causing a lot of harm. Sometimes I talk so too fast and I can't remember where I'm at. Just let me make sure I haven't. So yeah, the other piece is that this adversarial framing, right? It dictates how we interact with each other and who is in charge, right? So there's all these pieces that really reproduce inequities and cause more harms. And then just to say too, like when we're thinking about what justice is, I think we need to start thinking of it, not necessarily within legal systems, right? Because what I think is very true is that justice is not and cannot be confined to legal systems, and neither is it something that legal systems reliably produce. Like, that's just kind of the nature of it. So my kind of task today in thinking about justice, so when you hear the term justice, I want us to think of justice relationally. So this is a quote from one of my mentors and one of my committee members for my PhD, Jennifer Llewellyn, who's at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie. So justice understood relationally takes at its aim equality of relationship, not in the sense of sameness, but rather in the sense of satisfying the basic elements required for well-being and flourishing. What is required is relationship marked by equal respect, concern, and dignity. So just for our reference point for today, that's how I'd like us to just think about justice. And also, this is just a really great book that actually Brenda suggested that I read, and I think it was really helpful in how we think about reimagining our justice system. So really there's kind of 4 main points that the author, Sean Ginwright, really puts forward. And I think a lot of people are probably already doing this. I'm probably, speaking to everybody who's already in this space, but this idea of awareness. So not only like being aware of the lens through which we're seeing the world, but also like that mirror, how we're experiencing, how are we looking at ourselves and how we see things, the connection. And I think that, this was also talked about this morning, is this idea of disconnection. Like, seems to be the pathology, right? Is this like we're disconnected? So how do we connect? And how do we think about our relationships being transformative in nature rather than transactional in nature. And I think that this is really, the piece of that kind of business model that we do business in is really, it perverts the nature of our relationships. Also just thinking about problems in terms of creating possibilities, right? Because I think it's so like overwhelming sometimes to think about how do we address these really big, wicked problems. And then, just trying to be present and thinking about that, getting out of that manic kind of hustle and into a flow. So just one more thing to kind of think about as we go on in our presentation today. So that's it for me. Now I think Nelly, you're next, right?
Oh, I'm Brenda.
Brenda's next. Oh, so sorry. There's just one more thing too, and when we're thinking about harm in these systems, there's a lot of it, and I think COVID did a really good job of exacerbating all of those weaknesses in our systems. So just taking that time to reflect back on the last couple of years and the collective harm that we've all experienced, and what is it going to take to move forward? So I'll just kind of leave you with that to ponder as Brenda. Over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see each and every one of you.
Can I just ask you to put the previous slide back up so I can take a photo of it and really reflect on it?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. This little button will do it.
Thank you.
So each of us will have a reflection question following our presentation. Are we good? Okay. So I'm Brenda Morrison. Formally, I am the director of the Center for Restorative Justice at Simon Fraser University. But before that, I just had one of those pauses. Before that, I went somewhere else, but I'm back. Before that, I am a settler. My ancestors are settlers here on the traditional land, originally of the Coast Salish people. I currently live and rest my head each night on a little island called Kooijman, otherwise known as Bone Island, and where I've raised my family in a beautiful community. And I think that idea of community is really important to the work we do and where we walk in life. It's certainly an important adage in the field of restorative justice. So my ancestors came from the highlands and lowlands and islands of Scotland, and I think we brought a lot of trauma here. I know there's a lot of skeletons in my closet back there because we just shut the door, moved on. So I wanted to acknowledge that restorative justice is also trauma-informed, not only in the way individuals speak about trauma, but also collective trauma and intergenerational trauma. And in that work, I point to the current work of Thomas Hugo in being trauma-informed. We're hoping to bring Thomas next year to Vancouver. And so I have, we all have a lot of rich experience. I'm formally a social psychologist, but I also have field experience in outdoor education, governance, and justice. And so I wanted to share with you a little story of when I was an outward bound instructor down in Australia. And we did these 26 30-day courses. And I was the instructor, and in the middle of one of these courses, one of my participants came up to me, we'll call him John, and he said, "Brenda, guess what?" And he was really excited. I said, "What is it? What are you so excited about, John?" So I validated his emotional experience at the time. He says, "I haven't taken my lithium for 3 days." I'm like, oh shit. And this is before cell phones, like this was a few decades ago. We were in the middle of nowhere. And I have a man who hasn't taken his lithium for 3 days. I'm like, wow, that's really great, John. But you see those people over there around the campfire? They think we're going to get to Bass Strait in about 10 days. So if you get a lot of energy, we could use that energy to get us up those mountains ahead. What happens if you go the other way, John? What happens if you go the other way? He goes, well, maybe, I'm not sure. I was just so excited. So part of a restorative response is asking different questions. And I said, John, you know what? I can't police my way into making sure you take your lithium every day. And it's not just my responsibility, and I'm not going to police you, because I really don't know if those little pills are going to go down your throat or not anyway, but it's a collective response. So what you just told me, I want you to share with everybody else in that circle over there. And we had built enough community by then that he did that. And we took on collective responsibility to make it to where we all wanted to go together. And that's a shift in restorative justice as well. It's not just my responsibility as the police or my duty of care, it was all of our responsibility. And what's really amazing is not one of us thought John needed his medication for the rest of that journey. The minute we got back to civilization, he knew he did need his medication again. But there was something in the power of walking on the land together when we had each other's backs, and it was just us. And none of us was disposable. And those are essential ideas of restorative justice. So the idea of restorative justice came, we talked about changing lenses and looking in the mirror. This is the so-called grandfather of restorative justice, Howard Zare. This book came in 1990, and he talked about just looking through the world through a different lens, through the lens of the people you work with. And in looking through that different lens, asking different questions. So he basically said harm is fundamentally a violation of people and relationships, particularly relationships of the people most affected. And often the decision makers are not the people most affected. So we put decision making in the hands of most affected in the context of community. And that violations, harm, create obligations. And that we must take active responsibility in responding to those harms. And it's not a passive type of responsibility that comes often with different forms of punishment when third parties make that decision. And restorative justice seeks to heal and put things as right as possible, opposed to these imposed penalties or sanctions for harm. And at the heart of it are the 3 R's: respect, responsibility, and relationship. Sounds great, but operationalizing that is very hard. So we've been working on it and thinking about nuances, and I want to acknowledge that restorative justice comes from many different sort of traditional streams. Howard Zare is a Mennonite, so he draws on his faith. But a lot of the restorative justice movement in a Canadian context not only comes from the Mennonites, but comes from the Indigenous people who have walked on this land for time immemorial. So Susan Sharp is one of the visionaries here in Canada. And she said restorative justice is focused on the future, not necessarily on what is past. We take the past to move forward. It focuses on what needs to be healed, what needs to be repaired, what needs to be learned in the wake of harm. Is it a justice that puts energy into what needs to be strengthened if such harm is not to happen again? So it's about learning and growth. And because it's forward-looking, we use proactive measures as well as reactive measures. Like we build a culture to hold the harm and prevent the harm. So she has a few little touchstones. When we have a restorative justice process, we invite full participation and consensus. We keep going until we can agree on something we can live with. Healing what is broken. We need a full and direct accountability, not just accountability to the regulators, accountability to each other. We need to reunite what has been divided, because often we move into different silos, different camps. But really important is strengthen the community to prevent further harm. In your handout, we have this sheet. I'm not going to focus on it too much, but these are really key principles that you can apply to any situation when you're taking a restorative approach. whether it be the justice system, the education system, the healthcare system. So it's relationally focused. But we have to understand those relationships in the context of wider systemic and structural oppressions. So really looking at the power and equality and who's there and who's not there, and asking the whys, asking different questions. It's got to be comprehensive, holistic, and integrative. We have to get to the root cause of the problem and what's underlying the problem behavior that we can see. It's got to be inclusive and participatory, instead of what we call third-party decision-making by the decision makers at the top of the pyramid. We invite those most affected by the harm to respond to their needs. And in that, relationships are very complex. My late colleague Liz Elliott said, in studying the justice system, she said, what I discovered is that the problem was much deeper than a failed criminal legal system, that our work must begin in relationship to ourselves, relationship to each other, relationship to the land and our culture. So it has to be culturally responsive. And it needs to be, we still need to have a good outcome that we're all accountable to. So those are a few principles. And this is my question to you. What principles of the lens resonates with you? When you're looking through a new lens, what do you want to color that lens? What lens do you want to create a new vision forward? But also, what do you see when you look in the mirror of your own lived experience, your own reality, and seeking new ways forward in health and substance abuse?
Thank you, Brenda. So I think I've already introduced myself, so you don't need to see that. So I'm going to talk a bit more about how might we use a restorative approach in healthcare. So a restorative approach has the potential to be used in a variety of different areas, and we could use it in responding to a full continuum of harms, from complaints to adverse events and those sorts of things. Systemic racism or discrimination and racism are other areas. You could also use it in a toxic workplace environment with bullying, burnout, etc. And this is probably a significant area given our current context of healthcare. Conflict resolution in general, and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, as well as mental health. So this is comes out of the University of Wellington, and it talks about the different components of the restorative approach, being you can anticipate something, monitor it, or respond, or move along that continuum. And then at the bottom of the pyramid is more proactive, whereas the top of the pyramid is more reactive. And I think it's important to realize that it is a restorative approach is a continuum of components and pieces and activities that occur. And obviously there's room to be much more proactive than always being reactive. So a restorative approach, Allison talked a bit about this already, it changes the questions. And so instead of being a very traditional and sort of blame, shame, and guilt, we talk about, so who has been harmed, what are their needs, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs, and really considering all of those involved and engaging those in the process. And how do we prevent this from happening again? Learning from individuals, organizations, and the health system overall. But really understanding that so harm occurs for patients, family members, caregivers, it occurs for clinicians as well. And that's an important piece. And I think probably it occurs at various levels in the health system where people's arms or hands are tied, where they can't do things differently. given the current structures and policies that exist. So we've come up with this approach, looking at what are the potential benefits and outcomes of a restorative approach. And so it absolutely does provide an opportunity for apology and something that can be meaningful and creating that safe space and trust. So a lot of individuals who are involved in a harm incident, that is what they are looking for. And our current systems don't always support being able to provide apologies. It addresses needs, so it depends on whose needs and what types of needs need to be addressed. But it has that option to address the needs of harmed parties, and that could be psychological needs, it could be physical needs, numbers of different needs. Restorative approach is a storytelling approach, and so really understanding sort of what happened and that multiple perspectives versus just a one person or two people. And then also provides a space for equity of voice, so it addresses some of those power differentials. It promotes well-being, physical, emotional, and mental well-being. It's based on relationship, as Brenda has talked about, and healthy relationships are obviously therapeutic. Trust is a fundamentally relational practice. You can't have trust unless you have a relationship. And trust is often fractured and is gone once there is a harm incident that occurs. And then movements towards regaining and or establishing trust in the health system for patients and families specifically is really an important piece. Otherwise, we have people who have experienced a harm event but then no longer seek health care. And it isn't about rebuilding trust, because for some people, trust has never existed in the system. And that an example may be an Indigenous individual or a 75-year-old immigrant woman who can't speak English. And so it's very difficult for them to trust what's happening. A quicker response versus a litigation situation. Reduced cost. It seeks to treat and heal those who are affected versus then eliminating potential costs that may exist from that compounded harm. Culture shift absolutely requires a culture shift in order to implement this. It addresses systemic racism, as I've talked about already. And it helps promote action on health, equity, and social justice. And lastly, promotes learning. So considerations in using a restorative approach. And so thinking about the complexity of mental health and substance use and the health system overall, I think we really need to consider that before we enter into a full restorative approach. Risk aversion in healthcare. And so, health systems aren't really interested in having those open conversations. And so that becomes a challenging piece. Engagement of all those involved. And so the system, providers, patients, and families. And what often happens is providers are told they can't be involved, even if they would want to be involved. And so that's another issue. It has to be a voluntary process. No one can be pushed into a restorative approach. And a restorative approach is not for everyone, and it's not for every situation. So those are important things to consider. So my reflection question for you is, where might a restorative approach to address healthcare harm be used in mental health and substance use?
Nohoy na'in jinji show adili. Good to see all of you. My name is Cathy almost, and I am Cree, I am Gwich'in, and I am Scottish. I'm part of the Northwest Territory Métis Association. Happy to be with you today. And I currently live in Terrace. I'm on the beautiful land of the Gitxalatsu and Kitsamkale, people from the Tsimshian Nation, so that's in British Columbia. And I met these wonderful people through some restorative justice facilitator training and have done some work in cultural safety and have been on my own journey of who am I as an Indigenous person and what does it look like in the healthcare system and how can we move forward in a good way with patient perspectives as well as the healthcare perspectives, and what does that look like? How do we work together? So I am currently working as an engagement specialist as a consultant for my own company called Almost There Consulting. Happy almost. Yeah. I'm a cancer survivor. I love sports, reading, music, and I currently live with my husband and my cat. So it's been a good journey. I'm excited to be here today. This is probably nothing familiar to all of you because you work in government or you work for the system and you understand how important it is for all of the outside world of structural change. We were just talking about it this morning, that legislation, policy, and agreements have to exist in order for us to make big differences. So if you have any effect on structural change, what can you do in a good way to help with cultural safety, to help with restorative approaches? What would it look like to start there? And then as we move into the middle, we've got direct services and systems that are affected by the systemic change, so the organizations and the programs. And then the service delivery change actually happens through the one-on-one human interaction where people interface and interact with each other. This is where the promotion of culturally respectful and safe practices between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people becomes very imperative. We've talked a lot about being human, and we've talked about how important that is and the relational aspect of restorative justice. And this is a definition of quality from a First Nations perspective that promotes the process and outcome of our relationships, because we are relational beings, right? Who are our people during COVID? The people that we were stuck with the whole time, right? And as we get into back into the world again of relationships, what does it look like for us to be human with our clients, with our colleagues, with the people that we work with, and what does that look like? So as a definition from quality, this is the First Nations Health Authority. In BC, we have a health authority that is First Nations focused. And in this way, quality is ceremony, our shared connection, and traditional protocols. They nurture our relational accountability, and we continuously improve. So for the greater good, right? So that future generations have a better world. And so that's part of what we're hoping to do with the restorative justice approach. In BC, there's a few things that are happening right now. I don't know if you've heard about it, but the Cultural Safety and Humility Standard has just been released. It was created through First Nations Health Authority and the Health Standards Organization. And so they're wanting to build a culture of quality and safety. And so that is all about what does the patient complaint process currently look like in BC. Right now, people will go and make a complaint, and they're not sure if anybody has heard the complaint. They're not sure if anything's going to happen to follow up on that complaint, and so it's not really working for the patient perspective. Sometimes a lawyer gets involved and they make a lot of money, and that's basically what happens and where it stops. But what we're talking about is how can we do it differently? What does it look like to have a restorative conversation, a kitchen table conversation where we all get together and talk about what could happen? So the health system right now is trying to figure out what are we going to do about introducing a cultural safety and humility standard in an already tired system, and how are we going to do that in a better way? So that's part of what's happening in BC. The second thing that was alluded to by Ali is the In Plain Sight report. So Dr. Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon was asked and hired to ask the question, is racism happening in the healthcare system? What kind of proof do we have? So we now have 256 pages of proof about what happened in the healthcare system and stories of people. And then there's recommendations that have been made. So I just wanted to highlight 2 recommendations for you that have been made to develop and utilize cultural and restorative justice approaches. Recommendation number 4, and demonstrate respect for a diversity of Indigenous cultural norms and practices in all stages and elements of the dispute resolution process. So this would be an amazing recommendation to have happen, and that's one of our hopes. Recommendation number 5, that the BC government, First Nations governing bodies, and representative organizations, and Métis Nation, everybody together, you heard all of that, everybody together, jointly develop a strategy to improve the patient complaint processes to address individual and systemic Indigenous specific racism. I have a few more slides that have the stats on what happened for Indigenous people as part of their care. It's not a very nice story, but it's a very truthful story of how Indigenous people have not received the same quality of care. And that's part of my passion about this, is how can we help my people and my family receive care to begin with? And what does it look like for those disputes to be resolved, maybe through a restorative approach? So we're going to get you into small groups here shortly. We've talked to you for a very long time. And I'll let Nelly come on back up and give you some instructions on how we're going to work, but we're going to get you into small groups. And we're just hopeful for a better tomorrow. So how are you being culturally safe in your role and relationships with the First Nations, Métis, and any of the people you serve? What does that look like for you? That's my reflection question for you.
Great. So let's move on. So we did put flip chart papers on different tables, and we thought that the people could just turn around their chairs and work with the other table. If you don't have anybody to work with, just move around, or you can create a new group, and we have more flip chart paper here. But these, so you'll work together as a table, and we'd ask that you write your answers on the flip chart paper. And there will be a brief report back of one highlight from your discussions. So these are the questions, and maybe I want to work with question 3 first. So where do you think a restorative approach is most needed in the healthcare context? And I would focus specifically on mental health and substance use. What barriers do you see to implementing a restorative approach in mental health and substance use context? What facilitators do you see to implementing a restorative approach in this context? So where might it be used? Think about then those barriers or enablers to making that work. Questions?
Third one. Yeah, start with the third one.
Start with the
Where do
third
you
one.
think the approach is most needed in the healthcare context, in the mental health care context? What does that look like?
So we're going to give you probably about 7 minutes, 8 minutes to have a discussion about that.
Just like for senior. What's the number one barriers would be how would you accomplish it? You know that people have structures, but how do you move assumptions away? What do you do? Who are you going to talk to?
And so like
About these assumptions, right? It's gonna, how are you going to, what's your next baby step? So now you've addressed assumptions as an issue, so now what? Right, sort of mind map it a little bit? Yeah, this person, yeah, exactly. Exactly that. Right?
So and there was a position of the
like where they're saying, do I need to start?
You know, in some respects, she's done it, but she's consistently fighting
Some people like rules and parameters to work within, rather than looking at the.
The example we heard about the Catholic trip didn't want to take Lydia and stuff. So my thought about that was, good on him, why should he take it? He's actually subjected to harm. He's highly toxic drugs for life.
So where are you currently? You all work in different areas?
Right? What's he been told to do?
Yes, exactly.
So where another way of looking at it, where are people heard like
Shut up.
Oh, you're good. No, I'm
going to be saying this tomorrow.
in one kind of space, right? How do you amend that there were like, oh, how they get it.
well, like that's not a restorative approach.
It is.
I'm glad you said that.
And I would say, yeah, we are then, because we researchers are involved in that as well, particularly brain and trauma informed, evidence-based words and randomized controlled trials, and that's the only way we know anything is right. And communication. Lots of knowledge, yeah.
They don't want to eliminate all that stuff. They're in high position.
And that's more who, is that more who or where? Well, it's kind of both, yeah. The universities and funders, like funders would be, I guess you've kind of got that, yeah, grant funders, they.
So this is possibly based on grading, like the people
Based on
20, 30, 40 years old.
this particular person has been harmed.
They were like small scale right now. They
Yeah.
turning up the front of the education officers, police station. Because once you get up to the body, you can medical journal, health, whether it's related or severe.
The medical discovery. If I go back to the
Yes.
Oh, do you? Yeah.
your accent is
From different areas.
One of the speakers,
those who education, supremacy, that's what or not. They have to be a bit more critical.
And they,
How was it done? Well, I don't know what they need, what you're doing.
But I would say that they've done with and without intervention.
That would be the other thing. Sometimes it's with intention, but sometimes it's without. It's
Education,
ignorance
what are they going to be educated?
or lack of knowledge.
no excuse for that, I'm just saying that, yeah, yeah. Trolling for ignorance. Reminded me of that voice is that really cool. But if you have those I always would say challenge anything fundamental.
He left his job and started.
It just becomes an equity misplacement.
So their answer to your question was
We nailed it.
We did. This language, Linda Smith language too. Yes.
There you
go. The likelihood to take courses is very good. Very clever. Yes. Very low.
And that's why we must get on to it.
Facilitators? The baddies. Number three. No, I was just going to say, but I think that every Canadian, just like we need the TRC recommendations, they have to be lived and breathed by every Canadian.
Well, they're looking for the 2:30 wrap up, and if you think you need another 10 minutes, I'll tell them that you need
Yeah.
Well, I don't really do number 10 minutes. But
approximately 5 minutes in. And then we go into a break after that. So
a few minutes. Okay.
Yeah. How do we feed that?
How's it going?
Good conversation. You can show on through the shower.
And a lot of it's going to be not deliberate. So you for charity, some
I mean, it's very simple, but listening, like listening, don't listen and doing. Right.
And their answer space was 4 is where is it more needed? Well, what we need to do, where's the most needed? It's most needed in room number 2, the last and the people were trying to serve.
And where's number 2? We're getting to it.
No, don't worry about it. It's just
But yeah, I think that's kind of I think about in terms of like
It doesn't have to be like speak because
Okay, a 30-second warning, and then we'll get you back together in a group.
walk up those things. Don't forget this fragility. Don't This stuff means a lot. Sitting at a table. Well, that's challenging rather than or my mother was lived experience, which could create
Really hate to disrupt the wonderful rich conversations that are happening, and so, but unfortunately we are up against the break, and we're going to have to begin to, we'll have a few extra minutes, and then we have some time to have a bit of conversation. So if we can have everybody join back into a large group, that would be great.
I think also the other piece is we're going to move forward. Cathy, but also people really sometimes you're their own self how they move forward. Really like that wrong once you realize how you're
Brenda. Okay, we're not going to have people share per se one thing or each of the groups given the time, but I thought we could just open it up for discussion about what are some of your thoughts and where do we need to go from here.
And then it goes silent. And how is that possible? Yeah.
Any thoughts around?
I have many.
Yes.
We thought that change was needed everywhere, and so if we go into the minds and the behaviours of everyone, then we will capture mental health in general everywhere. And it was sitting at assumptions, our will beliefs, our views, your discussion about lithium and the example of restorative justice. You had a role to make sure they took the medication, but I have a role to make sure that my Indigenous knowledge system is one way of understanding distress that wasn't given any power in your example. So we all have we all have the ability to speak up, not humbly, because as an Indigenous person I'm very angry. Don't call it passion, I'm angry with this injustice. And so when I heard it, you lost me because of the assumption made. So it sits with assumptions, but I stayed and I listened and I loved where you're going, and I loved the example to be able to meet two people and share the work we're doing and basing it on our assumptions about whether two women can get married, our assumptions about being able, I've heard it several times, acknowledging the land of the people that you're from, but do you acknowledge the atrocities? Like every day I wake up on a land that was stolen from me. Right? So the assumptions that sit with that inside a mental health system, we're trying to care for individuals, but the majority of the individuals are Indigenous, and if the frameworks from a knowledge system that don't belong to us are there to describe and define my distress, well, you're going to get me fucked off again. So those assumptions are really, really important. And I speak with this sort of anger because that's what we've got to learn to tolerate. An emotional stamina to be able to sit in a space and agree or disagree, but stay. And then walk out expecting not to agree. And together we'll shift our world's assumptions.
Thank you. Yes, assumptions, dealing with assumptions, culture shift absolutely needs to occur. Other ideas, thoughts?
Very similar here.
Yeah.
Diana expressed it much more fluently and articulately, and from an Indigenous perspective. From a slightly different perspective, I was saying very much the same thing. That actually, I don't think receiving a wrong diagnosis of cancer, which I'm sure would be awful and traumatic and unnecessary surgery, is in any way analogous to the things that go wrong in mental health care, because the mental health care system is fundamentally based on the wrong principles, in my view. So in a sense, everything is wrong. Things that go right are kind of incidental. They're things that manage to sneak out. Whereas we hope that most routine cancer care is actually effective and appropriate, and we can see clearly when it's not. There isn't an argument about that. There's a very, very fundamental argument about the legitimacy of psychiatry. And I'm going to be talking about that tomorrow, so sorry. You're but yeah, I mean, what she said.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts? Any barriers that people were, or real challenges that you think we need to sort of work out perhaps to be able to move this forward?
I think there's a real thing that practitioners, service providers, people in position of authority and power are unable to sit into discomfort of the mistakes or trauma that other people experience. Because I think the medical model and most of thinking about healthcare delivery, we think about like getting to the outcome as quickly as we can and trying to reduce or minimize like punitive measures of trying to keep people accountable. But I think if you want to think about systemic change, we have to foster good conflict resolution techniques and good ways to sit in the discomfort. Let's sit in the discomfort of like what racism looks like in healthcare, what ableist communities experience in healthcare, what homophobia and transphobia exist in healthcare. It's a discomfort part that we try very hard to like run away from because perhaps we don't have the tools or we don't want to acknowledge that white supremacy is a big part of our healthcare system. And I think that's the part that I am most looking forward to is like more opportunities for all of us to sit in the discomfort.
And that's where change happens. That's where growth happens, right? Is in those places where there's that discomfort. I look forward to that too. Yeah.
Other thoughts? I know there was some talk about, liability, legal obligations, from different regulatory bodies as well, you know, some of those issues that occur. I know there was you talk about CMPA over in that group. I think we can very much say that we have had conversations with them, and they are very interested in this work. So, you know, maybe there will be a change in that down the road. But ultimately, too, what happens is that from a legal perspective, for the most part, you know, there isn't, they would much rather see the other system, right? Because it services their needs and pays their bills. And so that's a bit of an issue as well. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
I think it was you, yeah.
Okay, so but that brings it right back to sort of the monetization of care, and that we have a model that every minute of every caregiver's time is pretty much paid for. And so that doesn't allow the time to build the relationship or to build the trust, except in some circumstances, which I think are probably rarer than not. So the CMPA has a bottom dollar as well. Everybody seems to have a bottom dollar, and who's going to pay is the patient with their health, and not necessarily just with money.
Yeah, time is, I think, is a really big issue right now, and Jennifer Llewellyn from Dalhousie talks about that we can't tell people to do additional things. If we put another thing into the basket of what we need to learn to do and do, that's a problem. But we rather actually need to talk about how do we do things the same, how do we work differently, but not adding additional work. And so that's a really important key as well. Yes, and then we'll have to close.
Yeah, so we're in the work of transforming services, and I would expect that most burnt out, tired practitioners would like to do work where they thrive and learn from their errors real time and be able to change and tweak so they can add to their basket of knowledge in the areas that they haven't worked well in, of which sometimes they spend years and years with the same person doing the same thing, getting shit results and not wanting to come to work when they have to see that person, right? That's our human being response. In 2009, I met Scott Miller, and if you don't know feedback-informed treatment, it would be a great start. It transformed my life. I was a psychiatric nurse, I'm now a psychiatrist. If I hadn't have met that work in 2009, I wouldn't have the mirror on myself that I have now. And I'm a shit practitioner sometimes, but there are sometimes that I'm great, and some things work sometimes for some people. Wouldn't it be great if we knew that we were great naturally, but that from the negative feedback that we tweaked and learnt from the feedback of the people that we screwed over real time. Our job is to create safe spaces for that relationship, for them to tell me when what I did didn't work. But they're either trying to look after our feelings or too scared to share because you might let go of them. And if you haven't, please, feedback-informed treatment for practitioners in the room, and leaders and managers and funders.
Great, thank you. So thank you all for participating. I do want to highlight, there is a video link that we had asked or to be shared prior to the workshop. And so that is available on, probably on the website or something. This is, there is a video that was on some work on restorative approach that has been done in New Zealand. And so that is a great video to have a look at as well. So just hopefully Google Restorative Approach New Zealand, Joe Whaling, that will get you the link to that. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah,
and their evaluations.
If you would like to remind
Sorry.
we'd love to hear it.
Yeah. Thanks everyone. Once everyone got over their quietness, I think we're really good.
Sorry, I didn't.
Thank you so much.
Programs. No.